Hi, everybody. Welcome to the regulatory update section of the EISA's technical seminar today. First of all, wherever you're dialing in from, I hope you and your loved ones are staying well. This has been a particularly weird couple of months, both on a professional and a personal level, and I'm really aware that you're all kind of giving up some of your time today to join us in those circumstances. The fact that we're doing this by video only shows quite how much we've had to adapt over the last couple of months. But one of the upsides is that there are many more people who can join us today for the live session than perhaps we can normally fit into a big old meeting room in the city. So that's really good news. And for anybody who doesn't already know me, my name's Gillian Roche Saunders. I'm a partner at Dempy Associates, which is a regulatory consultancy. We help FCA-regulated firms in the venture capital space and tax-efficient product space. And I think more importantly for today, the reason I'm speaking to you is that I chair the EISA's Regulatory Committee. The role of the Regulatory Committee is to keep an eye on what's coming up for members, those members that are FCA regulated, like fund managers, asset managers, financial advisors, intermediaries, custodians. So we keep an eye on what's coming up from FCA or from Europe and identify how that's going to impact members. So today, I plan on using our time to, first of all, have a look at what the FCA is expecting of firms during this period of pandemic, and particularly look at a couple of the themes. I won't be able to go into all of the themes, but a couple of the ones that I think are key to EISA members. And then I'm going to finish off by looking at something that's going to come up later in the year, but will be incredibly relevant, which is the FCA's review of the alternative space, and particularly within that review, their focus on EIS, SEIS, and VCT firms. So, without further ado, let's have a quick look at the new landscape. So first up, we have the focus on putting consumers first. I mean, it doesn't sound that controversial, but actually when you think of the range of things that business owners are having to consider right now, including the trajectory for their business over, the coming months and beyond, all of the staffing considerations, including things like the mental health of workers, the employment of workers. There are a lot of competing demands, but in every single publication that the FCA has presented across the entire spectrum of the market, putting customers first is absolutely a kind of trend that shows up, a kind of theme that transcends all of those publications. So if there is no other question that you can answer at the end of this pandemic period, answer this one. How did you make sure that you kept the best interests of your customers at the heart of everything that you did? It's a big ask, but I think it's one that you will want to be able to answer at the end of this period. That is not to say that the FCA doesn't acknowledge that this is an extreme set of circumstances. It's not that they're unsympathetic with what's going on for firms, but they do want this principle 6, the best interests of customers, to be at the heart of everything you do. So I think getting practical, what's that actually going to mean in practice? Well, I think number one, really good communication with customers. So how are you getting the message about what's going on behind the scenes to your investors? For example, are you no longer accepting checks? Can they expect longer timeframes on certain services that you provide to them? And how is it going to affect your investment program? What does the pandemic mean for monies they may have already invested? So really think about how you're going to do that. Websites are a great tool. That's wonderful. And you absolutely should be having messages on your websites. There are some great examples out there from members. But also, what about more proactive information than that? At the end of the day, what the FCA is looking for is, and to be honest, commercially, I'm sure you want the same, but is that investors, customers will still have confidence in you as a provider and confidence in the products and services that you are, that you're presenting to them. which I suppose brings me on to new products and services as well. There are a number of those at present, and there are some, again, really good examples of how to incorporate COVID-19 risks. That's absolutely something you should be doing. If you are accepting new money in, you need to make sure that those risks are very much in front of the investor and part of their decision-making process. So absolutely make sure you cover that. And then also have a think about the really kind of customer facing parts of the services that you might provide. Complaints handling has had a good bit of attention from the FCA, so there's some good material on that. But I think probably wider than that, thinking about investor relations and investor support, as I'm sure you are already doing. In many areas, the publications tell you just need to comply, which we'll have a look at in a second. But this is one of those areas where they've been able to create some really useful latitude. Handily, it probably reduces the admin burden on the FCA as well, but I like to think that they're trying to be as helpful to firms as they possibly can be. So flexible staffing. There are 3 papers out about staffing. One of them talks about kind of working from home, and the FCA really just echoing the government's message that staff need to work from home wherever possible. The FCA is not expecting staff to be at work, not expecting them to be travelling, and is not expecting you to have huge numbers of staff in your office. If anything, I think they'd be asking you questions if they found that you did have a large infrastructure still working in town. However, there is a concept of key financial workers. There's a definition and criteria connected with that. And so if you do find that it's necessary in order to kind of keep core services going, that you do need some staff to continue travelling, it is worth looking at that, as I'm sure you already have. One of the key things that the FCA is flagging is that it's the senior management's decision as to who is a key worker. But perhaps more poignant than that, they have said that they think it is the CEO's decision, or the closest equivalent to the CEO. And it's their responsibility to ensure that only essential staff are designated in this way. So if you are CEO, managing partner, or equivalent, and you haven't been involved in that part of the process, I would suggest it might be time to have a quick look and make sure that you're confident that only essential staff are being given that designation of key financial worker. The flexibility is particularly helpful in SMCR compliance. The FCA is aware that multiple illnesses might come at once, that key staff and senior managers may well be furloughed, and it's trying to provide some practical advice that reduces the burden on your firm. So let's take 3 topics: furloughing, and how you record responsibilities, and the 12-week rule, all of which are kind of intertwined, really. If you are furloughing staff temporarily, and if some of those staff are senior managers, the FCA will keep the approval of those senior managers live on the FCA's register. You, however, will need to ensure that those members of staff remain fit and proper. And that's going to be, depending on how long this all goes on for, that's going to be quite interesting in terms of how you're going to ensure people are kind of keeping up to date with, say, CPD, how you're going to stay sufficiently engaged that you know that they continue to be fit and proper. So there will need to be a level of engagement there to consider in how you're managing the furloughing. The FCA has specified that the required functions, which include for members, compliance officers and MLROs, the money laundering reporting officer, that these required functions should only be furloughed as a last resort. So essentially they're going to be last in the queue for any furloughing. And any prescribed responsibilities for senior managers who are furloughed do need to be passed, and your default position is to pass those on to another senior manager. So you can imagine that with lots of illnesses and furloughing, that prescribed responsibilities may be moving around across the senior managers in your firm in a way that you perhaps hadn't envisaged when we did the senior manager work back in December, or in advance of December. What is useful to know is that you do not need to update your statements of responsibilities for any temporary absences during the pandemic. Of course, if you think you're going to be making somebody redundant at the end, that, you know, the situation's slightly different. But for temporary absences, you don't need to submit new documentation. What you do need is a live document, a kind of running commentary of who holds what responsibilities. So the FCA wants you to have an audit trail, but it's not going to expect that you necessarily keep it abreast of all of those changes. What is particularly useful is that the 12-week rule, that's the rule that enables you to pass to cover a senior manager function where the absence is temporary or reasonably unforeseen to another senior manager for up to 12 consecutive weeks. So that's the 12-week rule. That has now been extended to 36 weeks. So again, that gives you flexibility. If somebody needs to step up to take on a senior management function, that can happen, and you don't need to submit a new form to the FCA if it's going to be within 36 weeks. And again, if that is a temporary absence. Again, the person stepping in still needs to be another senior manager if possible. Having said that, you can also see in the guidance that the FCA is gearing up for scenarios where you may run out of senior managers. And there are provisions for some flexibility around that, which would be worth looking into, and I think worth looking into right now, because in order for you to be able to step somebody else up, who is not a senior manager, they need to have the right authority, the right access to information, knowledge and competency. Those are things that I would be building into your processes now. So if all the senior managers were suddenly not available and business wanted to continue, how are you going to make sure that people have the access to the decision-making tools they need? Can you be using this time now for training and shadowing so that you have extra flexibility should such a situation arise? The messages, when you look through them, the general message, SMCR and a few delays to Gabriel filings aside, are that you need to comply until you can't comply. That should be your default position unless the FCA has given you flexibility specifically. It's not always going to be possible to comply, and we've seen a number of scenarios where actually, best intentions aside, there are challenges and you simply won't be able to. We'd suggest when that's the case, you should take reasonable steps. You should probably write down your thinking as well, to make sure that you're doing, the best job possible in the circumstances. And knowing the FCA's focus on customer interest, I would definitely make sure that that's part of the thinking that you have, both that you have and also that you document. And also, it will be counterintuitive at points. But you will want to remember to engage with the FCA proactively. That firms are going to get into difficulties over this period. That is likely. The FCA is expecting to hear from firms about that. And sometimes you just want to fix everything yourself, and that, of course, is so understandable. But I think early proactive engagement with the regulator is going to go down an awful lot better than leaving it until until that moment has passed. So back to business as usual. This is one of the themes that the regulatory committee was monitoring incredibly closely before COVID-19 kicked in, and that was the alternatives review. Many of you may have received a Dear CEO letter in January about this alternatives review. The FCA was really giving a heads up to the industry about where its supervisory focus was going to be in 2020. And as you can see from this quote, which I won't read it all out, the focus is very much on client best interests and also making sure that investors weren't inappropriately exposed to risk that they may not have understood when signing up to the investment. And it's not that obvious because alternatives in regulatory speak means a huge array of investments beyond kind of fairly plain vanilla investments. However, we had on good authority that the FCA was interested in EIS, SEIS and VCT managers and in generally, I suppose, the ecosystem. And so we've been engaging with the FCA on that. Mark and I continue to touch base with the kind of team leading the charge on this. And they are interested. And what they're going to be doing is producing a survey for EIS, SCIS, and VCT providers. So key things to tell you. This is not, the FCA is really clear that this has not been driven by any particular harm that they've seen. It's really an exploratory mission. I suspect it's a part of the market they don't know as well as other parts. And so they really want to be able to learn more about it, learn how it operates, and they want to be able to map out the ecosystem. So I would read that as kind of the distribution network and how all the different kind of our members and other people in the EIS, SCIS and VCT space kind of fit together. So an exploratory mission, and the FCA had planned to run this in March and April. That has been pushed back. The latest, I think, we're thinking it's probably going to be kind of early autumn. The FCA understandably needs to focus on helping firms and customers through the pandemic period, so that a lot of resources has been pulled from non-urgent items to that area. And the first piece in that work will be a survey. It's going out to 600 providers, and it's going to be about 3 hours long to complete, which suggests it's probably going to be a kind of Q&A rather than asking you for tons and tons of documentation. And they're going to then analyse that and decide on next steps. So that could end up being kind of good and bad practice for the sector. In some kind of publication. It could create new rules. It might just be interesting information that then the FCA keeps on the back burner for their own thinking and kind of to drive policy thinking in future. So just a couple of slides on what to expect. So if you are going to think about this in advance, the Dear CEO letter really gives you a lot of the information that you might want to factor into any planning, any refreshing of the way you do things. So you'll have noticed from the quote that investor exposure to risk is a key focus, and that's really the first theme in the Dear CEO letter. It's also the theme that I think is the most relevant for the sector in terms of preparation. It's the one where I think the FCA will be particularly interested in, given the kind of themes that they've been talking to us about. So thinking about then inappropriate products and risks and investor exposure to risks, what could you have a look at over the course of the next few months if you wanted to check that you're in the right place? That's what these bullet points are for. I think I would particularly, well, they're all relevant, but particularly draw your attention to the clarity around risks and charges, that penultimate bullet point, and the top one, product governance, which is all about when you design a product, making sure it fits a pre-identified target market and how it ends up in investors' hands. So that whole journey, including how product providers make sure it ended up in the right hands and learn lessons about that to then feed into future iterations of that product or indeed future products. I think those are going to be particularly interesting to the FCA, and of course, you'll know from publications that the regulatory committee has kind of prepared over the last year or so that there's still quite live issues in this space, and so definitely worth having a look at. Distribution networks and incentives would be another area that I think could get caught up. Classification of clients, particularly that opting up to professional clients. If that's something you do, I would definitely look at your processes around that. Financial promotions, of course, the communications that the investors receive before they make investments. And then your appropriateness and suitability obligations, depending on which one of those applies to your models. So those are the obvious themes that could come out of an investigation of investor exposure to risk. There are other themes from the letter, but both these are quite kind of sector agnostic, I would say, and also they don't necessarily seem as live issues, both from what the FCA said and what we've covered as kind of in regulatory committees. That does not mean that they're not important. And also, I should say that the FCA has suggested they might update the questionnaire. It was fully drafted and was about to go out the door, with a couple of extra questions if things have changed as a result of the pandemic. So that might adjust where the emphasis goes. For example, client money and assets could become more important. But standards of governance within your firm, risk management, control over client money and assets, and financial crime were the other themes in the letter. And if you go back to the Dear CEO letter, it'll give you a good flavour of that. If you didn't receive it, not everybody did, there is a copy of it on the FCA's website. So that's it. So that's a wrap, essentially. Their questions, as Mark will have said, please do pop any questions kind of below, and also comments in the chat, and I'll take a look at those and see if we can help you with any of that. While you're doing that, just a quick recap. We looked at COVID-19 to start with. The rule of thumb: comply until you can't. But when you can't, take reasonable steps, knowing that the FCA's main focus is on consumers and making sure that consumers are at the forefront of any thinking, any decision making. And then, of course, if you can't, then make sure that you are proactively engaging with the regulator when you can't comply. And that really is the wisest move, even if it sometimes goes a little bit against the grain. And of course, the flexibility on staffing and on some of the returns on Gabriel may well provide you with some useful latitude. And then looking forwards, if your compliance team has time over the summer, do have a think about the alternatives review. That is not that it stayed as a priority. It will be happening, and it's just a matter of when. So if you do have any spare time once you've managed to settle things down in the pandemic, I would definitely turn your eyes to that and have a think about how you can best prepare for that. Well, that's all for now. Thanks very much for staying tuned, and I hope to see you again, hopefully in person at some point in the near future.